With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Tatiana Besarabova with Business Call to Action. With that, Tatiana, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and thank you everyone for joining us for today's session, a conversation with Ted London about his latest book titled The Base of the Pyramid, Building Businesses with Impact and Scale. As Jessica mentioned, my name is Tatiana Besarabova, and I'm the Knowledge and Partnerships Lead for the Business Call to Action. Business Call to Action is happy to be hosting today's discussion with our long-term partners, the Practitioner Hub on Inclusive Business. For those of you that may not be familiar with the Business Call to Action, let me give you a very brief overview. The Business Call to Action is a unique multilateral alliance that challenges companies to advance core business activities that are inclusive of poor populations and contribute to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. BCtA is endorsed and supported by 5 donor governments of Finland, the Netherlands, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and the United States. BCtA is hosted by the United Nations Development Programme. Today, we have 155 companies that responded to the Business Call to Action by making commitments to improve the lives and livelihoods of millions through inclusive business ventures that engage low-income populations as consumers, producers, suppliers, and distributors of goods or services. Today's webinar is an example of companies and practitioners learning from each other and gaining new insights on helping inclusive businesses grow and prosper. Without further ado, I would like to hand it over to our long-term friend and colleague, Caroline Ashley, who can tell you a little bit about the Practitioner Hub, and she will be facilitating today's discussion. Over to you, Caroline.
Great. Thank you very much, Tatiana. Thank you very much to BCtA for hosting this. I won't stop and tell us more about the Inclusive Business Hub because we'll have a slide at the end which will give you links to more information, including the slides, where you will find the recording afterwards, and more resources. But for now, I want to move straight on and introduce Ted London, who I'm delighted to have with us today. Ted's the Vice President of the William Davidson Institute and a fellow at the University of Michigan, the Ross School of Business. He's got more than I could possibly say even in an hour in terms of his track record of publications, research, and working with dozens of leadership teams on businesses at the base of the pyramid. And I tend to write blogs and read blogs, and I don't often read a whole book. But I actually really enjoyed this because it's a lovely mix of the academic and the practical. Because what's interesting about Ted's brain is he is both academic and very practical. So I think we're going to have a good discussion today. And at this point, let's hand over to Ted. We'll hear some slides. Ted's going to take us through his main argument with his slides, and then we'll have half an hour for question and discussion. So Ted, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Caroline. And I've never had anyone look inside my brain before, so this is fun. So I want to get started. First, thank you all for attending, and I gather folks are from a variety of different continents, so maybe your morning, your afternoon, or your evening, so I'm delighted you're here. I think we'll make it worth your while. And probably the big takeaway or takeaways from today is one is this is our time. I mean, those of us that have been in this space of inclusive business or BOP enterprise for a while, I mean, this is really our time to shine, but we have to do better. We're not where we need to be, and we need to keep getting better and better. And that's not somewhat of a surprise. I mean, I think most of us know that, but we also need to be a little bit more thoughtful about how we move forward. And that's sort of, you know, I think Caroline set it up nicely, where we can mix kind of rigorous thinking about what works together with practical applications to how to bring that to the field. And that was sort of the premise of the book I wrote is not can we do this, but how can we do this better? And that's what I want to talk about today, is a little bit about some of the tools and frameworks that I think we can begin to use to make enterprises more successful. So with that, I'll get started. And there's a little bit of a front end just to get everyone up to speed. And this is sort of what I was just saying, you know, it really is our time. We can use the power of business to solve vexing social problems, including impoverishment faced by the world's poor citizens. I think we've demonstrated that business can play a role. Our challenge is really we have to deliver better results. We have a lot of pilots, but we haven't got the scale we need. You know, if you think about the base of the pyramid, you're talking, depending on exactly how you define it, 4 to 5 billion people. Small is beautiful, but we need scale too, and we need more scale. And that, I think that's our biggest challenge, And what we really need now, I think, is a roadmap. People don't need to be convinced to do it. What we need to, again, move towards is how do we do it better. And I just want to start with a brief example to give you a sense. I mean, it is possible to go to scale, and you know, the cell phone and telephony offer is a great example that if you go back 15 years or so, you know, this was true. You know, half the world had yet to make a phone call. And when entrepreneurs and business leaders were talking about bringing mobile phone service to the base of the pyramid, they were often confronted with these challenges or these rebukes. One was, you know, the poor can't afford telephony, or the poor aren't smart enough to use a phone, or if they got a phone, who would they call? And it was sort of seen as kind of very aspirational but not very practical. But if you look now over the last decade and a half, you know, most of the growth in mobile subscriptions is in the developing world, and you can just see some, you know, some facts that, you know, 80 to 95% in Kenya, Indonesia, Mexico use texting. It's become ubiquitous. And just an example of a company, you know, if you think about Celtel, which started in you know, of all places, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which had 55 million people and only 3,000 phones. So again, who would the poor call? You know, 7 years later, it was acquired by Zain for over $3 billion, and it had operating licenses in more than 30% of the continent. And you're seeing other tech firms getting in this space, and the idea is it is indeed possible to scale. So I think we've demonstrated that it's possible. Now we have to do better. And I think what the other half of this puzzle is, you're seeing enterprises interested in growth, and what we're now seeing is the development community becoming increasingly interested in supporting business. And I think that there's been an evolution of this, and we can think about it kind of thinking about first the Millennium Development Goals and then the evolution to the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you go back to the Millennium Development Goals, Goal 8 was really about engaging partners, including the private sector. And what, if you read it, although it focuses specifically on a couple of sectors as maybe playing a more significant role, generally it was really about the idea of getting the private sector to help fund the development agenda. And, you know, and we can debate the success of the Millennium Development Goals, and everyone might have a slightly different opinion, but I think few would agree that it achieved everything that it aspired to do, hence the Sustainable Development Goals. And what we're seeing now is a fundamentally different view of partnerships with the private sector. And now, you know, of course, there's 17 goals, and the 17th goal is about partnerships. But if you read this little bit, you'll sort of see a transition here to funders to actually partner. So it says a successful sustainable development agenda requires partnerships between governments, the private sector, and civil society. Urgent action is needed to mobilize, redirect, and unlock the transformative power of trillions of dollars of private sector resources to deliver on sustainable development goals. I mean, that is a very different shift. Rather than as a source of funding, they become an active player. And if you go to the top of the slide, there's actually a lot of money out there, as we all know, engaged in development, and we're seeing more and more of it targeting supporting private sector activity. So that's a very big positive, where you've got companies, you know, including cell phone industries, thinking about growth, and you've got the development community thinking about how, you know, how do we solve our problems and how do we achieve scale? And these really come together. You know, and I think this is the powerful thing we sometimes forget, that there's actually a pretty good alignment between business development and social impact. That, you know, the business challenge is always about searching for growth, finding new customers, locating new sources of supply. And of course, for any business to be successful, they have to create value. So there's a search for new opportunities. You know, and you look at the development community, and, you know, I would argue their biggest challenge is scale. You know, and a question that often comes up is, what happens when the money runs out? Will this thing sustain and scale? And certainly, you know, if a private sector solution is in place and works, it can scale. You know, they have too many customers. They've got, you know, 4 to 5 billion now, and that's only going to grow in the next 2 or 3 decades. Support for local producers is critical. And then, you know, the development community needs to alleviate poverty. And, you know, if you are in the base of the pyramid and someone alleviates poverty, if you think about it, what have they created for you? Well, they've created value. And I think there's an important connection between poverty alleviation for the development community and creating value for the business side. And that becomes a nice link to say we can actually work together. Alleviating poverty isn't tangential to the business goal of creating value. And what we need to do is bring those more closely together. And that's really the promise, right? That we can create sustainable, scalable enterprises that truly alleviate poverty. And that's sort of, for me, what we have to do. And we're getting there, but we're not there yet. And certainly we have growing momentum. And I only show this slide, and I put this up is because sometimes people spend more time worrying about the words than the actual idea. And Base of the Pyramid, as many of you know, started in 1999 with CK and Stu here at the University of Michigan, really beginning to think about this as an opportunity for business. And it's evolved as an idea over time, and certainly there have been similar ideas with different names presented, but basically they're all the same. There are some minor differences, but the big idea across all of them is, can we create a sustainable, scalable business that truly has a positive impact on poverty alleviation? And each person may like their own term, but we shouldn't argue about terms. We should really think about the big picture. And we host events here at Michigan, and the idea here, and this isn't a complete list of our most recent conference, but the idea here is that sometimes people say, well, who is best suited for the base of the pyramid and these markets? And the argument is, if you look here, you can see all sectors are represented. We've got large companies, we've got powerful nonprofits, we've got leading foundations, we've got development community, and of course we've got social entrepreneurs. So there isn't one best approach. Just like in any market, I think there's a need for all different types. So we've got sort of this growing momentum. I think the conversation has changed. For those of you who have been in this space for a while know that, if you dial back a decade or so, business wasn't part of the solution. They were part of the problem. And the idea was this was two separate sectors, and it was really up to the development community to handle poverty, and business would only create more problems by being engaged. And that's certainly changed. And we've certainly seen growing interest from company and development partners to work together. And one marker of this, of course, is the growth of impact investing, where, if you look back a decade ago, there just wasn't that much going on. And now it's really a fundamentally new type of capital. We're seeing new resources. Certainly here at Michigan, we're seeing our students, some of the best and brightest, be really engaged. And I think all of you out there, are probably among the best and brightest. And we have the intellectual power, the drive to do this, and we're certainly seeing more ventures being developed and launched. But of course, there is a but here, which is we've had mixed venture success, and I don't think we've done well enough. And while it's our time, our window is not going to be open forever, and we need to have greater success. We've had lots and lots of pilots. I don't know that we lack pilots, but what we lack is scalable enterprises. We haven't seen enough businesses go to scale. We've seen that it's possible, but if we're talking about 4 or 5 billion people, we need more. And that's what's attracting the capital. We've had lots of activities, but not a lot of thought about what have we learned. There's been a sense that, well, everything's so new, I can just go ahead and get started and I'll figure it out as I go on. And I don't think that's no longer appropriate. And certainly we've had lots of cases and reports, but frankly, they've really been success stories. So what have we learned? What happened to the ones that weren't so successful? And what I really want to focus on here going forward is I think we don't need, when CK and Stu first put this idea out, it was really about getting people interested and thoughtful about where's the opportunity. As CK would say, it's really about motivating action. And I think we've achieved enthusiasm, and now we have to move to execution and better execution. And this just comes, as Carolyn said, I do have a new book out, and the real purpose of this book is to begin to think more clearly about tools and frameworks for moving forward. So this is just one quote. We've seen the promise of sustainable, scalable BOP impact enterprises, but we have more to do to truly deliver on that promise. We must continue to draw lessons from the experiences, successes, and the frustrations of enterprises operating in the field and identify what works and what doesn't. We have to get better. And this applies, to business in any sector, but, what I think we need is a set of tools And very much like the developed world, we need a set of tools that's standardized, a standardized toolkit that then can be customized to the local context. And it isn't that everything is new in base of the pyramid, and then every place we go we have to start all over. That's just not true. And like the Porter's 5 forces or the 3 P's of marketing, what we really need is a set of tools that each organization can then customize to the local context, right? So it begins to provide a framework for action. And what I want to talk about in my remaining time is just each of these tools. And I'll talk a little bit about design for success. How do you set yourself up for success? How do you really begin to plan for scale? How do you build a viable value proposition? And how do you develop the right ecosystem of partners? And if we get these 4 in place, I think we can increase the likelihood of success. I wish I could say we could guarantee success, but we can't. But what we can do is increase the likelihood of success, and I think that's where we need to go as a domain. So I'll just kind of briefly go through each of the tools, and then we can chat about them in more detail depending on what people want to discuss. And the first one is just, I've been at this broadly in the field for over 25 years. I went to Malawi in 1989 as a Peace Corps volunteer. And what I have seen working with many enterprises is if you don't get this internal design right, the odds are dramatically lower that you will not succeed. And in fact, I think I can comfortably say that I can look at this and see how companies are set up, and within 20 minutes or so, if they've got it wrong, pretty much guarantee failure. And and I'll talk about it in a minute, but this is so crucial. We have to get ourselves set up right. And the first one is, if you just look in the upper left, is resources. And I'll just give you a little example that I worked with a large pharmaceutical company, and they had decided that they needed to create a sustainable business that actually met the needs at the base of the pyramid. So they had, it was promoted by one of the top management team, one of the president of one of their divisions, actually the international division. They were given a decent budget, and they hired a very talented MD to run the initiative. And they decided that they wanted to get the best and brightest, so they sort of reached internally and said, look, we want to staff this team with some of our top people, and they put this out internally, and they were flooded with applications. Not surprising, people, they found people really want to have an impact in their careers. And they got, top strategists, top, accounting, operations, just a fantastic set of people. But frankly, with one fundamental flaw. They were all from the same company, all mainly with developed world experience. And they were very talented, but on balance, they didn't know what they didn't know. They didn't know much about the development community. They didn't know much about the base of the pyramid. So in some sense, while they were very talented, they were actually missing some key skills that really hampered them. In terms of metrics, they were, in some sense, I thought they were really lucky. They were given a lot of money without any real clear metrics, in the sense of they were given the freedom to learn and to innovate. Except they never then turned around and created metrics for themselves. And what in a vacuum, in a corporate vacuum, metrics, if you don't have them, they're attached to you. And over time, rather than beginning to develop a set of learning metrics, they just sort of went out and learned. And over time, what happened was people became increasingly uncomfortable in the sense that they weren't clear about the progress they were making. And without metrics to demonstrate progress, fairly soon, metrics were imposed on them that became much shorter term and much more profit-oriented. And that forced them to move up the pyramid. And in the end, what happened was they ended up, instead of reaching the base of the pyramid, they just moved incrementally down into the middle of the pyramid. So again, facing some challenges. And here what you're seeing is just a brief example of some of the issues that you need to really think about to get set up. And again, we can talk about these in more detail as we get to the Q&A. And the next thing I want to talk about is this idea of scale. And what we see all too often when you talk to an entrepreneur is their focus is on launching a successful pilot. And that, while commendable, is fundamentally flawed. The goal is not a pilot. The goal is a sustainable, scalable enterprise, and a pilot is a step on the journey. And sometimes we forget that. And what you see sort of in the middle of this, so you need to co-create with the base of the pyramid. You need to innovate and pilot, which really is about effective experiments and market creation, and then you need to really move to scale. And one of the things that we see a lot of is people don't develop effective pilots. You ask them what success is, and very rarely are there learning goals. They're generally about revenues and profits, but pilots aren't launched to generate revenues. They're launched to learn, to grow, to understand, and then, if successful, those learnings are taken to scale. And a really important example of this is often a failure to really think about market creation. And if you think about base of the pyramid, it's an impoverished consumer or producer that lives in an impoverished market environment. And many times, the key pieces of the infrastructure aren't in place. And companies tend to think that if we just can show success in a small area, this can scale. And market creation shows that's really not true. And a classic example would be clean water, where if you look at water, clean and dirty water really don't look any different, usually to the eye of the beholder. And oh, by the way, these people have been drinking this water for decades. Why should we change? And what's your value proposition? If you drink my clean water, what will happen? If you drink my clean water, the optimal outcome is nothing will happen. You won't get sick. So if you buy this product, nothing happens. All right? And that's a tough value proposition to sell. And oh, by the way, they're still going to get sick from other things. So how do you create awareness of a link between dirty water or water from an existing source and disease? And that's a very costly endeavor, and it's something that is very difficult to brand, so it becomes common knowledge. And very few companies want to invest in common goods, because once they've done investing, say they spend $2 or $3 million trying to create awareness, once they're done, someone else will just come in behind them. And there's very little retained value in all that market creation. But guess what? The development community really wants clean water. So they may be a great partner to invest in the awareness and the behavior change. And if you're going to go to scale with clean water, you need to go to scale with a market creation strategy, which involves the development community. And again, this becomes a key piece of piloting. And if you're not really thinking about market creation and pilots, the chances of going to scale are dramatically lower. So you may have, quote unquote, a successful pilot, but you won't be going to scale in a successful way. And then thinking about going to scale, I'm just going to touch on one, which is this idea of building social embeddedness. It's really about a capability. And the idea of going from place to place as a business is that it's more efficient and cost effective to do it within the organization than just go and start over in the market each time. So you've got to bring something from place to place. And what companies are very good at bringing at is capabilities. And the capability in base of the pyramid is really being able to go into a context and fairly quickly be able to identify key players, key partners, understand the market environment, understand the value proposition from the perspective of the base of the pyramid, figure out who to talk to, who not to talk to, or who maybe not to listen to carefully to, who to really pay attention to, how to aggregate this tremendous amount of information you get into a meaningful value proposition and build a robust business model. And that's actually a skill, a capability that can be built. And as you go forward, you can go faster and faster into new markets. And companies have to really pay attention to building and nurturing this capability if they want to go to scale. So
Ted,
again,
can I just interrupt you for a second?
Yes, please.
sorry, I know you're coming on to a slide on this value proposition. And what that value means, and we're getting a few questions coming in, most of which we'll come back to at the end, but one just while you're on this one on scale, could you define what you mean by scale? Is it millions in terms of revenue, millions in terms of people? That's one of the questions that has come in.
That's such a great question. And there's another question that may come up too that I'll have a similar answer, which is what is the right level of profitability?
We've had that question as well.
And I don't, and we should spend a little time talking at the end, but I don't know the answer to that, because a little bit about scale is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, have you failed if you reached 100 people? No, because small is beautiful, but I don't think it's enough. Do you need to reach 10 million? That would be great. But I think it's the aspiration has to be, in the hundreds of thousands or millions and trying to get there. What the right number is, I really don't know. I think that's but it's something of significance, and it really depends on the geography that you're in, the market that you're targeting. And the same is with profitability. That has a lot to do with the expectations of your investors, and you can have a mix of investors. Some may be willing to take less, others more. That's sort of the idea of impact investing, where you're trading off some sort of financial return for a social impact. And this is often where the development community plays a role, where they're willing to provide some seed funding, even some grant funding, to help change what would be financially a no into a yes. And I think we're going to see, an evolution of all these different types, and a lot of the returns depend on the type of partners that you've got and what their expectations are. In some sense, that's a good answer. In some sense, it's not. But we're going to get to this, is you need to build the right partnership ecosystem that can help deliver the right types of returns for your key stakeholders. Is that helpful, Caroline?
Yeah, let's let you finish on the value proposition and the ecosystem, and then we'll come back to the questions that are in. Yeah,
and that's exactly it. If I was going to, there's probably 3 or 4 things that I see enterprises, missing. One is they don't set themselves up correctly. 2 is they're not really thinking about scale throughout. 3 is they haven't really developed a robust value proposition from the perspective of the base of the pyramid. And the challenge here is obvious, yet it's missed a lot. What I often hear is it's too expensive, too complicated, or too time-consuming to really understand the impact that an enterprise has on the base of the pyramid. And the response is often, and that's information that's only valuable to the development community. And I would strongly disagree that impact is about value creation. And if you don't understand your value proposition, it's very unlikely you'll be able to build a viable enterprise, and you're certainly not going to be able to enhance the value proposition over time. And none of us would really dream of running a business in the developed world, the US, the UK, Japan, or even the top of the pyramid in India, without, or Nairobi, without sort of some sort of a discussion with those we seek to serve. Yet when you go to base of the pyramid, time and again, people come in and say, look, I know what they want. I know what they need, and I'm going to deliver it. So it's often a technology-led solution. Yeah, and that is a huge challenge. And what we really need to begin to think about is it's not that complicated to get a robust sense of the impact. And this is a framework that first appeared in the Harvard Business Review, and then we've used it since in the field a lot. But it's really about thinking about poverty along 3 dimensions, about economic well-being, capability well-being, relationship well-being, understanding that impact is more than just income. And the capability well-being is very much about, Amartya Sen's view of development as freedom. And of course, being isolated, being ignored, being biased against is a big part of poverty. And relationships really do matter. And I can give you, do I have time for a quick example, Caroline?
That would be great.
So, we've worked with a number of organizations that have provided, using sort of a distribution network. And I'll give you an example of one that used, it's called Vision Spring, and they provide eyeglasses. For those of you who are at this stage, you realize that it's not just for reading that you need to deal with presbyopia, but also for day-to-day work. You know, if you're a tailor or a tinsmith or anything, your productivity declines significantly over time. So you certainly see an impact on buyers. And what they were doing was sort of using an Avon model of distribution, working with women entrepreneurs who would go out in the rural areas with the kind of business in a bag and provide reading glasses and diagnose and provide reading glasses. And what they found, you know, and this wasn't a direct correlation, but fairly close, was the better the women entrepreneurs did, better the salespeople did, the more likely they were to drop out. And that's, one, it seems very counterintuitive, and two, that's a killer. If you're running a business and your distribution network isn't robust, it's very hard to be successful because it's very costly to train and to recruit and train and then get people out in the field that are effective, and your best sellers are leaving. So we looked at it, and you know, and you sort of, they were making money, so you're saying, okay, well, income, they meet the mark, so you'd say, well, okay. And some might argue, well, they're running out of people to sell to, and that's a possibility, but it didn't turn out to be the case. Certainly, if they're successful, they've built some capabilities, they probably have greater self-esteem. And then we began to look at relationships, and you know, this was particularly in rural India. And you know, what we saw was the better the women did, the more uncomfortable the husbands got, and the more likely they were to discourage them in a variety of ways of participating in the business. And when you begin to look at the different dimensions of well-being, you get a better understanding of the value proposition. And once you know this, then you can develop solutions. So in this case, it was about engaging the husbands earlier in the business so they felt they were part of it. And there are a lot of ways of doing that. And by doing that, you're now protecting your sellers and your distribution network, and you're creating more value for them. And again, by understanding the full value proposition, in this case for the sellers, allowed them to build a more robust business model and to modify their existing business model as they went along. All right.
Glad the answer wasn't just to switch to male distributors.
No.
Let's just pause on scale. We're having some questions on partnership, which we'll come to when you've covered the ecosystem bit. But one question is asking, in order to scale a pilot, should the problem that's initially tackled be around different locations and in different communities? I think the question is, should the pilot tackle different locations and different communities? Because you write some interesting stuff about the need to learn. And another one is how to overcome the cultures of kleptocracy during the scaling stage. And a third one is...
Hello?
Role of investors for replicability. Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Ted?
Yeah, I hear you now. I missed the third question, but...
Sorry. The third one is whether investors can help to replicate and therefore scale inclusive business. But Duncan, I don't quite understand your question. Perhaps you can type more. You're suggesting that's attractive to development people but not business. But nevertheless, Ted, we'll ask for your comments on the role of investment in replicating models.
All right, I'll tackle the first one, which was about sort of how do you begin to think about where and what you want to do in pilot. And, you know, the question that you have to ask yourself is, when I'm done piloting, what do I need to have learned? And that, if you can't answer that question, you're not ready to pilot. And as you begin to answer that question, you may find that you need to go to multiple areas, or you don't. I mean, there's obviously going to be an issue of prioritization. What do I need to know? And then the next question is, what's the most important things I need to know to go to the next stage? And you can have a multi-stage pilot if you want to, but the idea isn't just to pilot everywhere to test everything. You need to really have a clear idea of what is it I'm going to learn when I'm done. And guess what? Pilots don't have to be successful in the sense of proving a valid business model. What they have to be successful on is learning. And what we see is some people not testing the entire business model. They may test the distribution network, but not necessarily test the willingness to pay. Who knows? They may test the willingness to pay, but not the distribution network. And then they can move around and try different things. They may, really focus on market creation and trying to understand how to get the development community engaged and how does that go to scale. The key is to really think early about what is it you need to learn when you pilot and how do you go about doing that. And if you start with that framework, it sort of funnels down and it becomes a lot clearer about what the pilot should look like. And by the way, what we've often seen, unfortunately, is pilots of convenience. Well, you ask somebody, why did you pilot here? And they said, well, I knew somebody, or this partner wanted to work with me. And that's not a good enough reason for piloting. All you're going to do is launch something, but you're not going to get where you want to go. Because again, the goal isn't to pilot, the goal is to scale. And Caroline, the second question was around replication and scale.
And investment.
And what was the heart of the question?
Is en route to scale to replicate the business model, and can investors, either development practitioners or business investors, contribute to that? But Duncan was also expressing some skepticism that investment is actually attractive to business investors. I think that's what he was expressing. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, and I'm not quite sure I fully understand the question, so my apology. But the idea here fundamentally is for business to do this alone is going to be very, very difficult. They are likely, because of the issue of, if it was easy and fully profitable, it would have been done before. So the question becomes is how do we get partners engaged that will help us achieve both our profitability goals, whatever they might be, and our impact goals. And having those impact goals is what attracts the partners. And the idea is to begin to think about, this is not just a business effort, this is a collaborative business model. And it's not separate. The partners need to become more interdependent. And that's a new model of partnering. It's actually, it's difficult, but that's the way we have to go. If it was easy and businesses could do it on their own, they would have done it. And I do think, and we're engaged in a couple of enterprises deeply on the ground, and we do see both business and development being really interested in something that is replicable and scalable. And that's the power, that's the attractive idea, is that it's not just something small, that it has some legs. And people are willing to invest, and it's risky. And I think that sometimes we forget this, that, in the developed world, if you look at 10 businesses that start in year 1, how many will be left in year 5? And we have to understand that that number is probably going to be fairly similar in the base of the pyramid, and we have to recognize not everything's going to be successful. But we're going to have to develop a model where we can learn as we go and make sure that we're investing in the most successful approaches and increase the likelihood of success. Does that help, Caroline? Does that get?
Yeah, thanks. We're also getting some questions on partnership, but why don't we let you cover your slide on the ecosystem first, and then we'll come back to those.
And this is always a challenge. I apologize on a webinar that I'm doing most of the talking, which isn't the goal. So I'm glad you're stopping me as we go. So the next slide is just something. If you've been to Johannesburg Airport, you'll see it on the wall. So I can't take any credit for this, but I think it's really important that, and this happens so much. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think a lot of us in business want to go fast, and it really is easier to go alone. But I just don't think we can get where we want to go with that approach. And what we decided to do was to begin to think more about a new way of partnership. So an historical question has been, who should we partner with? And while that's an interesting question, I don't think it's sufficient. It leads you sort of to a step-by-step sequential approach. And we think a better question is, how do we build the right ecosystem of partners? And to do that, you need to begin to think about a robust set of activities that an enterprise needs to do. And we've talked about one distinction, which is you need investments for the enterprise, but you also need investments to create the markets around the enterprises. And then you need investments that enable you to take action, either as an enterprise or to facilitate transactions in the markets, and then you need to build the capability of either the enterprise or the market to sustain. And if you look in the lower left under Enhanced Enterprise Resources, what you see is financial capital. And when you talk to most BOP enterprises, that's where they tend to focus. And maybe there's a little bit of technical assistance attached to it. But there are so many other things that need to be considered seriously. And what an enterprise needs to do is to begin to think very clearly about, across this, what are we good at and where do we need help? And how are we going to fill out a robust partnership ecosystem that leverages our capabilities and the gaps we need to fill? And without doing this and doing it in a systemic way, it's going to be very, very hard to be successful. So again, we see this as a way to begin to understand and execute. And another piece that I think that goes along with this is, I'm a firm believer that every business, every enterprise serving base of the pyramid should have someone with this title or something very similar. And I call it a CED, a Chief Ecosystem Director. Someone who all or at least a major part of their job is really focused on building the right set of partnerships. And partnerships don't become sort of reactionary, or we heard about this, or we saw this grant, or we're chasing after this one capital. It's really about a deep understanding of the need to build a long-term sustainable ecosystem. And having someone in place that's committed to doing that can make a huge difference in terms of long-term success.
Ted, I certainly like your proposal for these CEDs, which is a nice way of reframing the typical sort of partnership liaison person, an ecosystem builder. So if I take you right, you're saying that people focus on partnerships in terms of access to financial capital, but they're neglecting the rest of your quadrant here, and that's leading to failure. Can you give us any examples where that has led to failure, or where tackling your quadrant has led to success?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And probably the biggest examples are what we did some work recently in Africa, both in Kenya and South Africa, to understand this. And being able, what we saw is enterprises that were just in the lower left really struggled to get anywhere, in the sense of they might be able to get a few minor pilots, but they couldn't really get traction. What we saw is they began to go into the upper left. They began to build relationships to really understand what was going on the ground. That made a huge difference in terms of being able to run a viable pilot. But until they thought about the right-hand side, this market creation, it was very, very difficult to scale, because the challenges of either demand creation, supply enhancement were so costly at scale that they weren't able to do this. And and this was primarily in the ag sector. And what we were seeing that was sort of leading to success was enterprises beginning to think about the entire value chain. So if you think about agriculture, the goal wasn't just to enhance productivity. Right? I can help you double your yield. That doesn't have a lot of value to farmers if they can't sell the excess. So it's also helping them facilitate their market transactions. And that's where we begin to see you really understand the robust business model. How are you going to make that happen? And what partners might you need to pull that off? And then the lower right is the most difficult. And here is probably where, if you need it, the development community can play a really important role, because it's very difficult to influence legal infrastructure or institutional infrastructure as an enterprise, but oftentimes engaging large development organizations can help facilitate that in some pretty important ways. Does that help, Caroline?
It's a nice framework. I'm going to interrupt you with two questions, because I think they're both really good questions. Jill Lackson is saying, yes, partnerships are essential, we all know that, but who pays for it? The cost of partnership development can be really huge, and I think we all know that's a reality.
It's, that's got to be part of the budget. if you're not sort of, if you're running a business and you haven't built that in, then again, the likelihood of success goes down dramatically. Now while I think, we're sort of talking about this from the perspective of an enterprise leader, the development community also needs to understand this. And those that are supporting enterprises need to encourage this and welcome the commitment to partnerships and support that as best as they can. And what we're starting to see is development organizations beginning, and I think it's still a long way to go, beginning to, if you will, create their own CEDs. Someone that's really responsible for thinking about the full ecosystem of partners and the role that they will play in facilitating this. So instead of thinking about themselves alone, they're thinking about the full ecosystem of partners that needs to be there for enterprises to be successful and how to make sure that's in place. And it's sort of, again, we talk a lot about, from the enterprise perspective, but the development community has to fully embrace this too. If they want private sector to succeed, what we sometimes see is the development community saying something like this: we're delighted to work with the private sector as long as they don't make any money off of serving the poor. And that's a fundamentally flawed approach. In the top of the pyramid, we are delighted, or at least no one ever complains when the government supports private sector. And an example of that, a classic example of that is food stamps, or now called SNAP, where in the U.S. it's billions of dollars are spent to provide the poor access to food. And now they get a debit card, and where do they go? I mean, they don't go to a government warehouse. They take their subsidy and they go shop at supermarkets. And actually, the #1 company in terms of receiving revenues from SNAP, from food stamps, is Walmart. And while Walmart may or may not have its flaws, very few people are protesting the idea that Walmart makes money off of serving the poor through food stamps, or all the grocery stores that are out there. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with the development community subsidizing support. It's, as the term has been out there, it's about smart subsidies, and it's about holistic support. And until we break that, I guess the false idea that development community can't help companies become profitable, we're going to really struggle. And they have to. They have to accept that profitability is a key driver for company engagement. And they've got to figure out how to make this work better.
Okay, we're getting lots of really interesting questions on partnership. It's obviously something people feel strongly about.
Sure.
I think what you're saying is doing successful business at the base of the pyramid does involve partnerships. That is an extra cost of doing business there because extra partnerships are needed, and it's a key area where smart subsidies are needed. Yep. We're having questions about what relationship dynamics need to be avoided when building or managing partnerships between stakeholders with different mindsets. And there's a few questions about these different mindsets, and someone else has asked, Saulo from about Uber in Brazil, they had to discuss the entire legal infrastructure to start their operations, and Saulo wants to know how to set expectations with all partners so they see the big picture. From all the different examples you've looked at, can you say anything about what works of managing relationship dynamics and setting expectations together?
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes back to this idea of the CED. You've got to have the capability to do this well. And I do agree it adds a cost, but it's, if you think about the cost benefit, there's no question that you need to figure out how to do this if you're going to be successful. So the question isn't, should we do this? It's how can we do it better? And I think, that's the direct, and I'll answer your question more specifically, but broadly, I think a lot of people are like, should we do it or how do we do this? The question isn't, should we develop enterprises for the base of the pyramid? Our real question is, how do we do this better, right? So we need partnerships. I don't think that's a surprise. The question is, how do we build a better partnership ecosystem? And how do we ensure that it's the right one? And oh, by the way, that it changes over time, which in part means some of your partners need to go away. They may be valuable at pilot, but they may not be as useful at scale. And that's important. It's an evolving ecosystem. And, and I used to work for Conservation International. And we, on the NGO side, and so I've had a little experience on both sides of this. And the challenge is getting people to understand each other. So in some respects, it's about having someone on your team that's bilingual. And I don't mean it, although it's great to speak multiple languages, I'm talking about languages across sectors. Really understanding what each other are saying and being able to translate that. Because the differences aren't as big as we think, but the way people talk and frame things makes it seem that it is a big gulf to cross. And part of it is having the right person that can both, there's sort of at least two or three things. One is they have to be able to speak the language of development to talk to the development community. But they also have to be able to bring this back to the company and translate it in a way that makes sense for the business. So what you often see is too many people saying, well, partners are just a necessary burden because I need funding. And then you've missed a big piece of the value of partnerships. And you've got to be able to translate that. And within this, and I talk about a little more in my book, and I won't, I can try and say a little more now, but it's really changing the mindset. It's not about two independent organizations that sort of pass in the night. You really need to create a greater sense of interdependence. And an example, yes?
No, sorry, go and give the example.
And just an example of this is, if you think about it from the perspective of briefly from the development community, that, they sort of, when they measure themselves, they sort of say, how much money did we give? How much technical assistance did we offer? And they measure that as success. But if you are going to engage in supporting business, a key metric for you must be the sustainability of the businesses you're supporting. And until you adopt that view that our success is tied to the success of business, this will be a challenge from the development community. And until business adopts the idea that creating value is tied to alleviating poverty, they will struggle to engage the development community and build a robust model. But they are very much the same. And the differences between the sectors aren't as great as people think.
Okay, Ted, our hour is nearly almost up, but I'm going to let us run till 5 past the hour because there's two questions I want to ask you on partnership and an excellent one about pivoting the business model from Stevie Valdez, and then we must move to the last couple of slides where we wrap up and give people the links for more. So just briefly, if you would, two on partnerships. First from Ekanath. Developing partnership takes time. In your experience, how long does it take to have a perfect ecosystems level partnership in an ideal world and in a weaker market? So you can just comment on time, and then I'm going to push you harder on returns to the business.
Yep. So, yes, it takes time. And that goes back, I'll see if I can go back a slide. It does take time. And how long depends on, this goes all the way back to the earlier slide of the team. Remember we talked about building the right team? You need to have someone that's skilled at this. If you don't have someone on your team that's skilled, it's going to take a long time. So how do you build the right team so that you can get going fairly quickly? And, then, part of that is really understanding what partners want and how do you build a value proposition that works for the business and the partner. And, I think it can take, 6 months at least to lay the groundwork. And then you can begin to think about, getting on the ground and then engaging. And, and this is a challenge, right? It can take 1, 2 years to develop a viable pilot. We worked with CEMEX and the Patrimony Oil Initiative for low-income housing. And, every enterprise has its challenges, but one of the things they did do very well was pilot and take that to scale, at least within Mexico. But it took them about 2.5, 3 years to build their pilot, but it didn't cost much. But they had aspirations of, millions of dollars, so spending tens of thousands isn't a big deal. But it does change our lives. If you're very much on a shoestring, then you've got to think differently. But again, you want to have aspirations of significant scale.
Yeah, So I think you're saying go slowly if you need to in that stage where you're not spending much, but you're investing a lot in the partnership and the pilot. Now,
don't rush to failure.
You're saying there isn't such a big gap between the business and the development community. Tomorrow on the Practitioner Hub, our newsletter, our mini theme is going out for this month, and it's on partnerships. Everyone who's a member will get it. And one of the blogs is by Tom Harrison, who's actually he says he's shifted his mind a bit on partnerships. He's a qualified partnership broker. And he says too many commercial companies are actually going into too many partnerships that aren't sufficiently on the nail of delivering commercial value, and they're entering development partnerships without making sure they are going to deliver the bottom line, and they go wrong because of that.
Yep.
Does that resonate with you at all? It seems slightly different to what you're saying, is that, oh, there's not such a big gap and it's not so scary and it's really important to get out there and partner with development stakeholders.
I think it actually resonates, and I agree. It goes back to this idea of partnerships of convenience versus having a strategic focus on who you want to partner with.
Okay.
And if you don't understand what you need from partners as a whole, you're going to end up like that with the wrong partners. So the goal isn't to partner, it's to find the right organizations to partner with. And that was the whole point of this framework, was because there's a lot of people out there that are offering partnership services of different types across all of these things. How do you make sure you're building the right set? What are you good at and where do you need help? And if you're not thinking that way, strategically about partnerships, I think you can wind up in exactly that position where you've got the wrong set of partners. You need to reach out and figure out what are the partners we need and how are we going to get them.
Okay, so this slide looks like you could have many partnerships, but you actually do have to be quite careful to have the right ones and not have too many.
Right, and you've got to figure out within this, what are you good at? What are the things you don't need partners for, and where are the ones that you do?
Yeah. I'm going to just move to another question, which is not on partnerships and ecosystem, but I think is a really fundamental one about your approach, if that's okay, which says, your toolkit focuses on solidifying the business model as a first step. The lean startup methodology focuses more on testing and pivoting the business model. Can you explain how your toolkit or framework aligns or differs with the lean startup approach? Good question.
Well, I think it's, and it is tied, and if you take a look at the book, we talk about it, or I talk about it, but it's really about, this gets back to piloting. What are you doing? How are you piloting? What's the model for pilot? What are the goals of piloting, and how do you execute? And I don't see any difference. It's just, how do you begin to think about piloting? And is it a lot of, we work with some partners that their goal is a lot of rapid experimentation. But they know, like they may want to say, well, we want to figure out what the best sort of packaging or best pricing option is. And they will change those as they're piloting to figure it out, because that's their goal. They're very clear about what they want to learn, and then they figure out how to execute it in their pilot. And certainly lean startup can be effective for some pieces of that. So I think it's actually very much in alignment. It's just really thinking about what are your partnership goals and how do you want to execute.
Okay, great. Can we just really quickly whiz through your last slides and get to the last one with the wrap-up links for people? And I will try and let you finish and we'll summarize and close.
So I will whiz through, and I think, and I guess the point of the last few slides are to say that this is, I think an important way of thinking about base of the pyramid, that we need to create more tools and frameworks that will help increase the likelihood of enterprise success. But, this isn't the end all and be all of frameworks. This is I think an important step towards doing this. But like anything else, we're going to continue to evolve and learn, and we're still out doing this. Every time, when we develop frameworks, we go out in the field, we learn, we get the next set of questions, and we keep pushing. I mean, that's what, as you said in the beginning, Caroline, that's what we really focus on is rigorous thinking, but then what are the practical implications and applications from that? And we keep working in the field to do that. And I don't want people to leave to say, well, that's it. This is, Ted thinks this is, all we're ever going to need. I think this is an important set of things that are going to continually evolve and develop and be further refined as we go forward. But what we don't want to assume is that we don't know anything about successful enterprises. And I know there's pushback on partnerships, but in some sense, everyone's sort of agreeing that we need partners. So the real question is, how do we think about partnerships in a more effective way? And what are the tools and frameworks to do it well? And that's where we need to go to. And again, it's about creating a set of standardized frameworks, like I've tried to present, that can then be customized for the existing context that each enterprise faces. And I think that's a key next step in the evolution of the base of the pyramid domain, or the inclusive business. So I'll kind of, I think we can achieve the promise, and I think we have to move in this direction. We want to create value, we need to seek scale. And I guess I'll stop there, but the question for us, again, isn't launching a venture. What we need to do is launch ventures that are sustainable at scale. And that's the impact we need to have. And then that's where we need to, I think, move more of our focus towards, is what does sustainability at scale really mean, and how do we achieve it? So I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to chat with people sort of, in different formats, but that's some ways to contact me.
Thank you very much indeed, Ted. And if we just move to the next slide, we'll be able to see where people can access further information after this.
I don't have control of that.
That was great. Thank you so much for sharing your framework and your thoughts. And I have to say, the course goes into much more detail. I really like your point in the book about how you need to focus on innovation, not execution.
Right.
And sometimes if you focus too much on execution, you just don't get the model right at the start. There's lots of really interesting gems and takeaways. Let's go on to the next slide, please. As I say, on the Practitioner Hub tomorrow, we'll be sending out our newsletter, which is all about partnerships and picks up many of these themes that Ted has been talking about. The slides are available on this bit.ly. You see at the top, bit.ly Ted London, I think at this very minute, if people want to go there and find them, or if not, in a few minutes. And the recording of the webinar will be available very shortly. And there's more resources in Search Inclusive Business, which has 1,400 publications on inclusive business, including a whole load on the topics that Ted has talked about, viability, partnerships, and so on. So with that, I want to say thank you very much to Business Call to Action, our hosts, and thank you, Ted, for joining us today, and thank you, participants, particularly those of you for your great questions. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll just add my thanks as well. Wonderful discussion, Caroline, and thank all the participants. Great questions, and hopefully this dialogue continues on the Practitioner Hub and beyond.
Grand. Yep, I hope so. Thanks very much, Ted.
Okay. Bye now.